Hey there, ever look at the US government and wonder how it all holds together? Well, a great way to think about it is like a three-legged stool. You need all three legs, working together to keep it balanced. Understanding this is a huge deal, especially for the GED. So let's jump right in.
So let's start with a big question. Why can't the President of the United States just make any law they feel like making? It's a fantastic question, actually, and the answer gets right to the core of how the whole system is set up. It was all designed to make sure no single person could get too powerful.
You have to remember, the people who founded the US were really wary of concentrated power. I mean, they had just fought a whole war to get away from a king. So when they built this new government, they built it specifically to spread that power out from the very beginning.
And that big idea has a name: the separation of powers. Honestly, the easiest way to think about it is like a big company with three totally separate departments. Each one has its own specific job to do, and no one department gets to call all the shots.
Okay, so if the government makes rules for the country, where do those rules actually come from? Well, that brings us to our very first branch, the legislative branch. You probably know it by its more common name, Congress. This is where every single federal law gets its start.
So what's their main gig? Simple. Their number one job is to make the laws. Now, Congress itself is actually split into two parts. You've got the Senate and the House of Representatives. And they do more than just write up new laws. They control all the money, a huge power called the power of the purse. And they, and only they, have the power to officially declare war.
So once Congress passes a law, what happens? Does it just go into effect on its own? Nope. And that's where our second branch comes into play, the executive branch, which is led by the president.
And their job is pretty straightforward, at least on paper. If Congress writes the laws, it's the job of the executive branch to enforce them, to actually carry them out and make sure they're being followed across the country.
And this branch is more than just the president. It's also the vice president, the cabinet, and all those federal agencies. The president has some major powers, like being commander-in-chief of the military, but a really key power, and we're going to come back to this, is the power to veto or reject a law passed by Congress.
All right, that brings us to the third and final piece of this government puzzle, the judicial branch. Basically, we're talking about the entire federal court system here.
So what do? Their number one job is to interpret the laws. They're like the referees. They look at a law and decide what it actually means, and maybe more importantly, whether or not that law is even fair and follows the rules of the Constitution. And at the very top of that whole system is the Supreme Court. Now, their biggest, most important power is something called judicial review. This is huge. It means they can look at any law from Congress or any action by the president and say, nope, that's unconstitutional, which basically wipes it off the books.
Okay, so we've got our three separate branches, each doing its own thing. But, and this is probably the most important part of this whole explainer, they don't just work alone in their own little bubbles. They are constantly interacting and kind of keeping an eye on each other. This whole network of interaction is called checks and balances. It's basically a set of built-in rules that lets each branch limit or check the power of the other two. It's what keeps the entire government from tipping too far in one direction.
Let's look at a perfect example of this in action. Say Congress passes a bill. The president can check that power by saying, I veto this. But it doesn't end there. Congress can then check the president's power by voting again. If they get a big enough majority, they can override that veto and make the bill a law anyway.
And that brings us to what many people call the ultimate check. Because let's say Congress and the president both agree on a law. Even then, the Supreme Court can step in and use that power of judicial review to strike it down. It's the final backstop that makes sure everything the government does follows the Constitution.
So let's wrap this all up. What is the one big thing you really need to remember from all this, especially for your test?
Here it is. The U.S. government works like a team, not a one-person show. You've got three branches with three totally different jobs, and they are all held together by this system of checks and balances. It's that constant push and pull between them that keeps everything stable and prevents any one part from running away with all the power.
So, I'll leave you with something to think about. When you look at the system today, the president's veto, Congress's ability to override it, or the Supreme Court's judicial review, which one of those checks do you think is actually the most powerful? It's a great question. Good luck with your studies.